Hello everyone, welcome back to the NPTEL course on materials informatics. In this lecture we will be talking about graph networks. And just as a recap of what we did in the last lecture, so we looked at convolutions as a set of mathematical operations which can be integrated into neural networks. Typically when you have convolutional neural networks you have sparser networks, so fewer parameters, which implies the network has lower variance and higher bias. It can also sort of do a lot of hierarchical learning. So systematically it can decompose a very complex let us say an image input into smaller features that could be lines, curves and so on, and then put them back together again. So it decomposes the image into smaller features and then sort of via combinations of features it puts them back into more and more complicated shapes. And convolutions basically depend on three major processes. So you need to define a receptive field for each neuron, need to define what kind of features you are looking for, so filter, and also how are you going to make the network sparse, so basically do pooling. So it sort of works well for any structural data, so images, text and so on, and we will see in through the course of our discussions on graph networks, convolutions also play a very important role in how graph networks work. And some of the hyperparameters we also looked at this, so this could be receptive field size, number of filters, type of pooling, padding and so on. So in this lecture we will look at graph networks. So the sort of the lecture on graph networks marks almost the end of the first 1/3 of the course, or the first module of the course, which is on sort of classical machine learning topics. So this will be the last sort of lectures which will use some schematics from this textbook of Aurélien Geron. I will also use schematics from these two websites here, and unless otherwise mentioned. These two are very useful introductions to understanding how graph networks work. Okay, so what are graphs, right? So before we understand graph networks we need to understand what graphs are in the first place. So graphs are they have a very simple straightforward definition. They are a collection of objects and a collection of connections between those objects. So each object can have different number of connections with the other objects within a graph. So the objects are usually referred to as nodes in a graph, and the connections are usually referred to as edges. And there are sort of various sort of practical networks or practical connections in different applications that can be represented by graphs. So for example, if you think about your own connections with your friends, family and so on, so you as an object, you as a node in a graph, you have various connections with your friends, family and so on, right. So if you illustrate your connections with other nodes or other real humans, that is basically the creation of a social network, right. So this is an example of a social network graph. We can also define graphs for economic relations between countries. So how dependent is one country on another in terms of imports, exports, what is the net trade balance and so on. Biomedical networks, so how energy and information is actually transmitted in biological systems. And in general IT networks, so these could be internet, these could also be in terms of academic networks, right. So who cites whose papers, which topics get more traction in academic research and so on. In general you can also view internet as one giant graph, because every computer, every laptop, every tablet and cell phone is connected to other electronic devices. So these devices, each device can basically be considered as a node, and it has connections to other nodes. And as I mentioned, in biomedical networks you can also have network of neurons, and a very complicated network of neurons is basically our human brain, right. So in several practical domains you can have you can represent the collection of objects in that domain and the connections between them as graphs. So it turns out that you can also use graphs to represent simpler objects such as images. So for example, this image, if you focus on the darker pixels, represents the image of a smiley, right. So these are the two eyes, this is the nose and this is the smiling mouth. So you can think of this as a representation of a smiley image, like a smiley cartoon, and given this image, so this is a 25 pixel image, right. So each pixel is colored differently. So given this image, we can actually represent this image in the form of a graph, right. How do we do that is, so let us say we focus on this particular pixel, right. So this pixel is referred to as 2 2. So it basically is it has a row index of 2 and it has a column index of 2. We have row indices starting from 0 and column indices also starting from 0. So it is the 2 2 pixel, and this 2 2 pixel is associated, so it is nearest neighbors with these 9 pixels, right. So you have 1 1 2 1 3 1 here, 1 2 3 2 and 1 3 2 3 3. Apologies, they are not 9 neighbors, they are 8 neighbors, right. So 3 here and 2 here. So there are 8 pixels that are immediately in connection with this central pixel, right. So this we can actually readily represent in the form of a graph, right. So here is our 2 2 pixel, which is represented as a node here, right. The 2 2 pixel is connected to its nearest neighboring pixels, right. So 2 1 3 1 1 1 1 2 3 2 1 3 2 3 and 3 3 here, and those connections are what are represented by the solid dark lines here, right. So there are 8 connections basically, and if you do the same exercise for all the other pixels in this image, we can basically represent this whole image onto a graph, right. So images can be represented as graphs. One another sort of mathematical way of representing graphs is through what is referred to as an adjacency matrix, right. So given that you have a pixel in mind, we can sort of have a one hot encoding here. So if the sort of pixel is colored, or if the box is colored, then those two pixels share a connection. If the box is not colored, then it's not, they don't share a connection. So like this we can actually define an adjacency matrix which can be used to mathematically represent this graph, right. So just to summarize, right, so images can be represented as a graph, and images are what are referred to as graphs of regular structure. What I mean by regular structure is each pixel in an image has a fixed number of neighbors, so they do not have infinite neighbors, and all pixels generally have the same number of neighbors except the edge ones, right. So in general there is a fixed number of neighbors for all the individual pixels or individual nodes. So images can be considered as an example of a regular graph, right. So just like images can be represented, text can be represented too. So let us say you have a sentence that looks like this. So you have graphs all around us, for example. So we can say that the word graphs here is a node, same with all around and us. So there are 5 nodes here. And graphs sort of shares an edge with only R here and not any other word in this sentence, right. So the word graphs only has one connection. The word R can have 2 connections, so it can have a connection with the word graphs and also a connection with the word all. But if we treat this as a forward moving sentence, so we typically read sentences from left to right here. So you can sort of think of this as a directional graph. So each word only shares a connection with its next word. So what comes after is what is more important than what comes before in this representation here, right. So the word or basically has a connection with the word all here. The word all has a connection with around and so on. So we can represent this as a adjacency matrix as well. So you see that graphs has a connection with R and none of the other words, R has a connection with all and none of the other words and so on, right. So we can represent text as graphs too, and there are 2 different ways that we can represent text as graphs, either as undirected edge, where we do not worry about what is the actual direction of propagation of words. We can also be more specific and we say, okay, R should follow graphs, all should follow R and so on, and that's those type of connections are referred to as directed edges. So if 2 nodes can be connected either way, so if they can be if the connection can go either from in the forward direction or in the backward direction, it's normally referred to as an undirected edge, but if it goes only in the forward direction, it's referred to as a directed edge. So images typically are represented by undirected edges, texts typically are represented by directed edges, right. So just like images and text, right. So we can also represent molecules and crystal structures in the form of graphs. So for example, if you take this sort of a simple organic molecule, right. So you have a carbon sort of ring here where along with nitrogen in one of the edges, you have sulfur, you have OH and O and so on. So we can, the way to represent this molecule in the form of a graph is to basically consider individual atoms as nodes and the bonds between atoms as basically edges, right. So we can sort of represent this molecule in an equivalent graph notation that looks like this, right. So these three nodes are your carbon atoms, this is your nitrogen, this is your sulfur, and this is your OH group, this is your O and so on, right. So this is a very simple representation of this molecule in the form of a graph, right. We can do the same for any crystal structure as well. So this is a simple sodium chloride crystal structure. So the sort of yellow ions are sodium, the green ions are basically chlorine. So we see that if you look at this sodium, for example, it shares connections with 4 chlorine here and also more chlorines if you extend the periodic boundary conditions. So we can sort of say that each sodium has connection to 1 chlorine, 1, 2 and 3 chlorine atoms here. And the number of connections is sort of given as 2. So you see that one sodium here is connected to the same chlorine atom twice, right. So there is one edge here and the other edge here, that is to indicate that this sodium atom has a connection with this chlorine atom here at the center of the cube and also its periodic image that is outside the cube here, right. So its periodic image is the same chlorine atom, right, and that is why it has 2 connections. Same thing with these 2 chlorine atoms, right. So this sodium has a connection with this H-centered chlorine and this H-centered chlorine. Both the chlorine atoms are the same, they are basically the periodic images of one another. So that is why this sodium has 2 connections with the same chlorine atom, and each sodium has 6 connections here. So it is basically sharing bonds with 6 nearest neighbors here, right. So this is a very simple representation of a crystal structure in the form of a graph, right. So we once again represent atoms as nodes and bonds as edges. Okay. So let us sort of technically also understand what is a graph, right. So as I mentioned before, graphs are nodes or points that are connected by edges. So edges can also be considered as links or bonds. And once we construct a graph, we can actually store or learn information across 3 different levels. So we can learn information that is pertinent or that is relevant to each node or each atom, and this knowledge is referred to as node attributes or node features. So we basically learn something about each node. So this could be how important a node is. It could also be something like what is the mass of this atom, or what is the energy associated with adding or removing the atom and so on. So we can sort of think about properties associated with a given lattice site or a given atom in a structure or in a molecule, and those attributes are referred to as node attributes. So think of these as relevant or related to atomic properties, right. We can also do the same with respect to all the edges. So each edge can have certain properties associated with it. So in a practical sense, each edge is a bond, right, in a molecule or a crystal structure. So each bond has features associated with it. So how long or short a bond is, how strong or weak it is, how much energy do you need to break the bond or form the bond and so on, right. So there are several different attributes or features that we can associate with different edges, and those can also be learnt using a graph network. And the third is the what are referred to as graph attributes itself, or properties of the overall graph itself. So these are emblematic of structural properties. So structural properties could be something like what is the formation energy of the structure, what is the band gap of the structure, what is the elastic modulus of the structure, and so on, right. So all the structural properties or structural attributes are learnt across the overall graph itself, right. So and these are referred to as graph attributes here. So when you construct a graph, you can do or you can learn at different levels. So you can go from nodes to edges all the way to the overall structures. Okay. So now that we have understood the utility of graphs, so how useful they are in sort of representing molecules, crystal structures and so on, we should also understand what are some of the issues with a graph. The first issue that we can immediately think of is the variability in the number of nodes and edges, or basically if you think of size of a graph, the size of the graph can actually vary dramatically between different systems, right. So what is size of a graph? Size of a graph is basically collection of number of nodes and number of edges, right. So if one graph has 10 nodes and 10 edges, another graph has 20 nodes and 40 edges, then graph 2 has a different size compared to graph 1. And this is fairly straightforward to understand, right. So let us say you take two different molecules here. So this is one sort of complex organic molecule, this is another complex organic molecule. Basically the molecule on the left is a non-toxic molecule, the one on the right is a toxic molecule. So if you want to go through a set of organic molecules and classify them based on toxicity, then we need to ensure that our graphs can model both this molecule on the left here and the molecule on the right here, right. So if we think of a simple graph representation of the left molecule, right. So you see that there are 4 different rings, so there should be at least 4 different ring representations on your graph network, whereas the molecule on the right just has 1 ring, right. So we straight away see that the size and the number of edges, right. So the number of nodes and number of edges, or the inherent size of the graph itself, is going to be very different for the left molecule and for the right molecule, right. So if you now want to create a graph neural network that can actually go through all the sets of organic molecules and classify them based on toxicity, then we cannot really construct them in a systematic fashion, right, because how do we account for the fact that one molecule will have 20 nodes while the other molecule will only have 5 nodes, right. So this is an inherent problem with graphs, and in general neural networks do not deal very well with varying number of input nodes, right. So when you design a neural network, you typically ensure that the number of input nodes are fixed, and then you sort of play around with what is the depth of your neural network, how it is connected, what kind of convolutional operations you perform, and so on, right. But the input nodes are almost always fixed, right. But here we see that the input nodes are going to change. So how do we fix this problem? So this is one problem with graphs. The second problem is what is referred to as node order invariance. So for example, let us say I have the same graph, right. So and let us say I sort of label this graph as A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right. So I am starting with here, and then I sort of go down in my graph labeling my nodes, right. Now if I take a different, if I take the same graph but then have a different naming convention. So I start my A here, so I do A, B, C, D, E, F and G, right. So both the graphs are the same, right, but if I were to write an adjacency matrix representation of this graph and this graph here, I see that just because I have changed the labels, right, my adjacency matrix is going to look very different, right. So in other words, just by labeling atoms differently or just by counting atoms differently, I can have very different matrix representations of the same graph, right, and this is again a problem with respect to representing your graphs, right. So if you have a structure and if you want an equivalent representation of a graph, even if I rotate a structure, so that is equivalent to sort of naming the atoms in a different order, right. Even if I rotate the structure, my graph should either rotate accordingly or it should understand that it is a rotated structure and remain the same, right, so that its mathematical representation is consistent. But with the standard definitions of graphs, this is actually not ensured, right. In other words, if you change the order of atoms in your structure or in your molecule, is going to change how the graph actually eventually looks like, right, and this is something that we do not want, right. So these are two issues that we have to deal with whenever we try to represent structures or molecules in the form of graphs, right. Luckily these problems have been fixed. So one way of solving the variability problem, so two different molecules having different sizes of their graphs, is to use the principles of what is referred to as representation learning, right. So what is representation learning? So it basically tries to represent each node in a graph over a fixed size vector, right. So the basic result is that you have a representation of any given structure, any given molecule in the form of a set of embeddings, right. So think of embeddings as a higher dimensional representation of whatever graph that you have generated for a structure, and different structures irrespective of the number of molecules they have, number of bonds they have, will always be projected onto the same high dimensional space, right. So that is the idea behind representation learning and the generation of embeddings. So broadly we take different structures, we assign or we represent each nodes in a structure, and also this also applies to each of the edges in a structure. We will perform some mathematical operations to ensure that both the structures are represented in the same high dimensional vector space or matrix space. Right. So we generate embeddings of the same dimensions for both the different structures. So that is the idea behind representation learning. So how do we typically do or generate these embeddings or do representation learning in graphs? So we initialize each node and edge by a fixed size vector. So each node, let us say that size is an hyperparameter, is a design choice. So you could initialize each node with let us say 10 attributes. Those 10 attributes can be okay, those are generally atomic attributes. So you can say okay, atomic number is important, atomic size is important, mass is important, its electronegativity is important, ionization energy is important, and so on, right. So you can define 10 different properties of an atom and assign those as the attributes for your atoms itself, right, or for your nodes itself. You can do a similar thing for bonds as well. So once again you can consider bond length, bond order, bond strength, and other sort of variables that you want to attribute to a bond as well. So for both atoms and bonds, so nodes and edges, we represent each node and each edge with the same sized vector, right, with the fixed size vector. The size of that vector is determined ahead of time. So so once we determine this, or once we represent the nodes and edges as fixed size vectors, we will do some mathematical operations which we will describe in the next few slides, and we will try to generate a single high dimensional representation of the overall structure itself, right. So we will try to get or represent all structures in the form of embeddings, okay. So that is one part of the solution. The second part is we also have to preserve node order alongside variability as well, and here is where we will perform some mathematical operations preserving the node order, and the final output that we will get will basically represent both nodes and edges of the same sized vector. So we will basically get the same sized embeddings vector at the very end. Okay, so let's first try to understand a little bit of how do we solve node order invariance before coming back to the solution for variability. So for solving node order invariance, we are going to once again use principles of convolutions that we saw before in convolutional neural networks for image inputs, right. So in the case of images, right, so what we basically do in convolutional neural networks is that we define a receptive field for any given neuron, right, on the previous layer, and then we do some kind of filtering and pooling operation, right, to get one representation or one value for your higher layered neuron based on whatever it sees in its lower layer, right. So that is what we do in our convolutions. In graphs we also do similar convolutional operations. So what we do here is that so let us say you have a node that is that is connected here, which is 7 here. The node is connected to one nearest neighbor 3, right. So basically what this node does is it learns about its nearest neighbor, right, and then updates its own value, its own specific value. So you can think of this representation of the structure of the graph as the lower layer in some sense. The values of nearest neighbor nodes basically influence the value of the node, the corresponding node in the higher layer, in the upper layer, right. So these two, so this is the lower layer graph, this is a higher layer graph, right. So nodes that are connected to their nearest neighbors, the values of those nearest neighbors is going to affect the value of this node in future representations of the graph, in higher representations of the graph. So just to give one more example, right. So for example, if you take this node 3, this has 5 different neighbors, right. So it initially has a value of 3, its future value is going to be determined by the values of its neighbors in addition to its original value, its older value as well, right. So this is a simple convolutional, what is referred to as a linear convolutional operation in the case of graph neural networks, and these convolutional operations basically are referred to as message passing operations, right. So what happens when we do message passing is that when we take any given structure and do multiple rounds of message passing, we can ensure that the node order almost always remains invariant. And the reason for that is, if you take any single node, right, it will always have the same set of neighbors irrespective of how you actually label the node, right. So for each node, as long as you do message passing, so as long as you learn about its nearest neighbors, right, it does not matter what its original label was, it will always converge on to the same final label, because its nearest neighbors are going to be the same, right. So this is the way we ensure node order invariance in graph networks. Okay. So just to mathematically represent and understand how this how the convolutions work, right. So let us say you have an initial set of initial set of features, right, that is represented by xv here, and then after the kth iteration or the kth round of message passing, your values of your graph of your node is basically updated using this sort of a mathematical function here. So you have a set of weights, you have a set of biases, you take in the previous sets of weights as well, right, and then these terms correspond to the values or the attributes coming in from your nearest neighbors, right. One simple way that you can take in values from nearest neighbors is to just take a arithmetic average, right. Another way is to take the maximum value, another way is to take a simple summation and so on. So there are several different ways that you can actually take in values from your nearest neighbors, right, and you can pass it through some kind of a activation function as well, right. So this function, this weights and these biases are basically learnt, so the activation function is a design choice, but the weights and biases are basically learnt during the training of your graph network. So to give an analogy, right, so the activation function is the same as that of convolutional neural networks. So they are also every time you multiply your input nodes with a filter, you can pass it through an activation function. So the activation function is usually optional, but the weights and biases are basically corresponding to each feature map that you generate using different filters. So basically one filter or one iteration here has the same set of weights and biases for all the nodes in a graph. So similar to all the nodes in a convolutional neural network. So in a convolutional neural network, each feature map had the nodes in one given feature map had the same set of weights and biases. So the same thing here, the nodes in one representation of the graph, so or the kth representation of the graph, all of them will have the same set of weights and biases, right. So only when you do subsequent rounds of message passing, you will accumulate more and more weights and biases. So this ensures that there is no parameter explosion in our graph networks as well. And the sort of key thing to keep in mind is that after you do k rounds of message passing, right, or you build k message passing layers, so each message passing layer is equivalent to a convolutional layer in our convolutional neural network. So after k message passing layers, each node learns about neighbors that are k hops away, right. So if you do one round of message passing, each node learns about its nearest neighbors, so which are one hop away. If you do 2 rounds of message passing, they learn about next nearest neighbors. 3 rounds of message passing, they learn about next nearest neighbors and so on, right. So message passing is a very convenient way to ensure that graph networks to ensure that graph networks are node order invariant. Okay. So just to visualize message passing, right. So let us say you have a set of this can be a simple molecule that that is represented by this graph. So let us say you have a set of nodes, right. So each node is represented by its own set of features. So you have a blue atom here, you have grey atoms here, and then so you have a darker blue and then you have a lighter blue atom here. So lighter blue atom has lighter blue features, darker blue has darker blue features, and then you have the grey atoms, right, which have their own grey features. So this is the initial this is how the graph network is initialized, and if you focus on this node atom 1 here, right, it is connected to 3 different neighbors. So it is going to take in information from these 3 neighbors here, and if you do one round of message passing, you see that some of the features are looking more and more grey like, right, and for each of the grey atoms, since they also learn from other atoms in their neighboring layers, their colors are also changing here, right. So initially all the atomic features appeared pure, and now since they are learning from their nearest neighbors, sort of the atomic features are mixed with respect to knowledge coming in from the nearest neighbors as well, right. So how do we actually learn from your nearest neighbors? So basically you take the set of features that you had initially, you aggregate the features that are coming in from your nearest neighbors. This aggregation can once again be a sum operation, can be a max operation, can also be an average kind of operation. So there are different ways that you can actually aggregate information, and once you have aggregated, you simply do an arithmetic sum and update your node features. So just like you are updating node features, you can also do the same exercise for your edge features as well, right. And if you do multiple rounds of message passing, you see that all the atoms have learned from their neighbors and all the features appear quite mixed. Okay. We can also stack in message passing layers. So if you keep building in more and more message passing layers or increase the number of convolutions that you have in your graph network, your receptive field increases, right. So this is also similar to how convolutional networks work for image tasks, right. So initially you decompose your image into smaller lines and curves, and then you get more textures, and then you get parts and so on, right. Same thing here at the sort of lower layers. You only get information about one let's say your nearest neighbors, and then when you do one more round of convolution or message passing, you get information about your next nearest neighbors, next nearest neighbor, and so on, right. So each atom, its knowledge about its neighbors, its nearest neighbors, keeps increasing as you keep stacking message passing layers or convolutional layers, right. But one thing to keep in mind in graph networks is that if you do too much message passing, so if your graph is very small and if you do too much message passing, right, basically at the end of several message passing layers, all the atoms will sort of look identical, right. So you see that initially here you have different colored atoms, right. So you have red colored, green colored, blue colored atoms and so on. If you keep smoothing over or sort of learning and relearning features from your nearest neighbors, next nearest neighbors and so on, eventually all the atoms would have learnt all the information that is there to be learnt in the graph, and all the atoms will appear identical, will appear very smooth. So this is a situation that we would like to avoid, because this means that there is no distinguishability, right, when it comes to your edges, when it comes to your nodes and so on. So basically this is like a graph that is made of identical atoms, right. So we don't want too much message passing, but we would like to have an optimal amount of message passing so that atoms learn about their nearest neighbors but still retain their individual identities, so that the node and the edge attributes are actually distinct across different atoms and different bonds. Okay. In terms of message passing itself, there are several different techniques by which you can do message passing. So you could, for example, update your nodes first and then your edges. You could so this is what is referred to as node then edge learning. So you first update your nodes, and once your nodes are updated, then you sort of pass on the message to your edges and then update your edge features. You can also do the other way around, so you can first update your edges and then update your nodes. You can also do it simultaneously. So there are several different ways by which you can do message passing, and the way you do message passing is basically design choice, right. So there are different graph network packages available, and each of them have their own design choices. So it's up to us to choose one that sort of works well for our task at hand. Okay. So I said that we will come back to variability problem, right. So variability is one of the core issues in graph networks, and we need to find a way to represent whatever atoms and bonds we have into a higher dimensional space, into a single higher dimensional, preferably a vector space, which is referred to as the set of embeddings. So you generate different kinds of embeddings for different structures that you have, different structures, different molecules that you have, but the dimensionality of the embeddings should be the same, right. If that is ensured, we basically solve the variability problem, right, and we said that we will take principles from representation learning to solve this variability problem. And the sort of final solution for fixing this variability problem is basically the pooling operation, right. So this is once again similar to the pooling operation that is done in convolutional neural networks. So in convolutional neural networks you take an image input, right, and then after doing convolutions multiple times you get a stack of feature maps, and then you do a pooling operation which helps you flatten or reduce the dimensionality of each of your feature maps. So initially you may have fairly large feature maps, and then when you do a pooling operation you start reducing the number of feature maps. Maybe that causes an increase in the number of filters that you would need to analyze the image. And at the very end, so after you do multiple rounds of convolutions as well as filters and pooling, the final operation that you do in convolutional neural network is a flattening layer, which is basically a pooling operation. So you flatten it, you flatten the final representation of all the feature maps you have into a single a single high dimensional vector, and then you pass that on to a multi-layer perceptron, a dense neural network, to finally make some predictions. So that could be classification or regression tasks. Graph neural networks have a very similar architecture as well, right. So here again you do a set of convolutional operations, and then you accumulate representations of both your nodes and edges, and then we do finally what is referred to as a readout operation. So a readout operation is the same as a pooling operation, right. So it's often referred to as a readout layer, the final pooling layer, which sort of flattens, so basically finds a way to mathematically represent your varying graph into a single higher dimensional vector, right. So how do you actually do this flattening operation? There are again several design choices that we can choose. One choice is to take all the maximum values. So let us say you have 10 different columns here, you take the maximum values of those 10 columns, and then you represent that as a single 10 dimensional vector, right. So there are different pooling choices that are available. Those are either design choices or hyperparameter optimization choices, but this pooling operation is critical to ensure that your graph networks are not varying in terms of their representations when it comes to when it comes to different structures and molecules. So once we generate this high dimensional vector, we then pass it on to a dense neural network, and then we ask it to make predictions. So that can be either classification or regression tasks, right. So just to summarize, so there are multiple ways of readouts that are possible, and you can also have readouts or pooling layers between the graph convolutional layer, between message passing layers, between your graph convolutions as well. So this is similar to adding in pooling layers after every 3 or 4 layers of convolutions that we do in visual task convolutional neural networks, image task convolutional neural networks, right. So we can have readout layers. There are again different choices possible. Their placements can also vary, but these readout layers are necessary for any overall structural level predictions. If you want to make predictions on the structure itself, that could be the properties on the structure, properties of the molecule, toxicity or not, stable or not, metallic or not, and so on. If you want to make predictions on the entire graph itself, then pooling is a must. So we definitely need to represent the graph in a single higher dimensional vector space. Okay. So now that we have understood graph networks a little bit, it's also important to understand what kind of hyperparameters or design choices we have. Apart from the design choices that I mentioned before, like the type of pooling and so on, there are also other choices that are out there. So the first is the number of graph neural networks itself, or the depth of the layers. So think of it as the amount of message passing that you actually want to do in your network. Second is the dimensionality of each attribute. So how do you represent your node and edge? Is it going to be just a scalar? Is it going to be a 10 dimensional vector, 100 dimensional vector, and so on? And whether or not you want an activation function when you do message passing. So that's again a design choice. If you want an activation function, then what kind of activation function do you need? So the activation functions are also referred to as update functions in graph neural networks. And then the type of pooling or the readout operation that we actually require towards the end of the graph. The type of the readout operation is important, and also its placement. So whether you want only one readout operation towards the end of the graph, or do you want multiple readout operations over the course of the graph. And then finally, how are updates done? So what style of message passing, right? So do you do edge first and then node first and then edge, or do you do both? Right? Those are all design choices. There are implementation examples of graph networks. We won't go through those examples in detail in this course, but I encourage you highly to look at this Medium tutorial and also this Keras example, which are mainly for property predictions for molecules, right. So they represent different molecules as graphs and then they try to predict the properties of those molecules. These are very nice tutorials, very nice examples that you can go through, and it will give you an idea of how these graphs work for molecular systems. Okay, let us get to the final aspect, which is when it comes to representing crystals, crystals are a little bit different from molecules, right. So in the sense that they have typically when you represent a crystal, you represent your crystal in with respect to its unit cell itself, and the unit cell is has periodic boundary conditions, which means atoms keep repeating, right, under in all three different directions. So here we need to ensure that there is what is referred to as translational invariance. So let us say you take the same sodium chloride structure, right, you have your cube that is originally defined like this, now you shift your cube. So basically you go from unit cell 1 to unit cell 2, its properties are not going to change because it is the same crystal that is being represented by your second unit cell compared to your first unit cell, right. So if you do any kind of translations like this, your graph should not change, and whatever properties it is predicting also should not change, right. So this is an additional condition that we have for crystals, right, and the best way to sort of include these periodic boundary conditions and ensure that there is translational invariance is to basically consider a cutoff distance, right, when we form edges for any given node. So for example, let us say this is periodic representation of a crystal structure. Here you have an atom of reference here, and if you draw a cutoff radius around this atom, you see that this atom is only connected to 5 bonds and not more than 5 bonds, right. So in principle you can have infinite number of connections to this atom because your crystals are typically infinite representations of your unit cell, right. So if you draw a cutoff radius, your graph that is or the graph that is representing this atom itself, right, is going to remain invariant irrespective of whether you choose this unit cell or you choose this unit cell here, right. So if you translate this atom from here to here, its local representation or its graph representation is going to remain the same, right. So introduction of these cutoff radius are actually fairly important for ensuring that you are introducing translational invariance when you are modeling crystals with graph networks, right. And one of the first implementations of graph networks for modeling crystal structures, for modeling solids, is this crystal graph convolutional neural network or CGCNN. We will do a small hands-on exercise also on CGCNN as a subsequent part of this lecture, and it has been written in PyTorch. Very simply, the way CGCNN works is it uses all the ideas that we have discussed in this lecture. So it sort of represents your crystal structure in the form of atoms and so in the form of nodes and edges, where each atom has a cutoff radius associated with it to consider what kind of edges it is going to form, right. And then you sort of define a set of attributes for each atom and for edges as well. You do several layers of message passing. You do a final pooling operation where you create a flattened representation of your crystal structure, and then you pass it on to a dense neural network for creating for predicting some outputs. The outputs can be several properties. So the same graph network can be trained for predicting a single property, so that could be like a formation energy, or you can also ask it to make predictions on multiple properties, right, on formation energies, band gaps, elastic moduli and so on. So both are possible, and this CGCNN is a very nice and simple and easy to understand graph network model that was first designed for modeling crystal structures. So as I mentioned before, we will sort of look at CGCNN or come back to CGCNN in our small hands-on session that will follow up this lecture. So with that, let me summarize our discussions on graph neural networks. So graphs are a natural way to model materials. So you can sort of represent atoms as nodes in a graph, bonds as edges in a graph, and the overall graph itself represents your structure at hand, right. And in modeling structures we have a few challenges associated with graphs. So we need to use principles from representation learning or embedding and combine it with pooling to ensure that graphs are not varying with respect to the size of your crystal structure or size of your molecule that you are presenting to the graph. Convolutions help us solve the node order invariance challenge. So convolutions in graphs are normally referred to as message passing, right, and in the case of crystal structure specifically we also need to introduce a cutoff radius to make sure that our graphs are translationally invariant. So if you go from unit cell 1 to unit cell 2, the graph representation does not change for the individual atoms and edges. And some of the hyperparameters associated with graph networks are the number of convolutional layers, size of your embeddings, activation functions, pooling, readout operations and so on, right. So all of these are hyperparameters or design choices. Depending on the package that you use, you may have to tune some of them, or you may have the flexibility to modify the design choices by yourself also. So those are some of the hyperparameters that we need to worry about when we deal with graph neural networks. This is not the last of discussions of graph neural networks. So when we go towards the end of the lecture and when we talk about interatomic potentials, transfer learning and so on, we will revisit graph networks. So graph networks are a very natural and a powerful way of representing molecules and crystal structures, and in modern day sort of materials informatics, so the study of materials on a very large scale, graph networks are inevitable. So you will almost always have to use graph networks to model the materials and their associated properties. So with this we come to an end of the sort of first module of the course, where we wanted to study about different machine learning topics ranging from classical models to neural networks to more advanced topics such as graph networks and so on. In the next lecture onwards we will go to the second module of the course, which is more physics based models, and we will start with discussions on density function theory. So with that I thank you all for joining today. I will see you all in the next lecture.